Can we count them off?
Sure. Who are the nays, please?
This is Abby and I was a nay.
Okay.
Ava, nay.
Ross, nay.
This is Yolanda, abstain.
All right, thank you. Motion passes. We'll move on to public comments. We have not received any public comments for this meeting. We're reminding the public that they're welcome to submit written comments if they come after the deadline that we've set for trying to organize these for presentation to the committee at our meeting. Then they will be posted directly to the CAC's webpage when the minutes of the summary of the meeting is posted. All right, our main item today is regarding all things RTA next development and categorical elements. For this first item on the RTA next development, I'm very happy to see that Pima County Supervisor Rex Scott has joined us. And as you all well know, Supervisor Scott is also an RTA board member, and pleased to have you here, Supervisor. And if you have anything you'd like to address the committee on, we'd be honored to hear it from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to join all of you today. I wanted to start by thanking every CAC member for your time and your commitment. Not just the folks who've been involved since the original CAC was formed, but those who joined when this board made the new appointments. It is a significant time commitment. And from what I understand, perhaps a significant emotional commitment as well. And just very much appreciate that. I mean, this is, as all of you know better than me, an unpaid position, and your commitment to engage in this process with each other and your commitment to be working on behalf of our community is very much appreciated. I know just not by myself, but by the other 8 members of the RTA board. And I wanted to start off by telling you what I shared with my colleagues as to what I think are my 2 roles as the county's representative to both the RTA board and the PAG Regional Council. One of them is to work with my colleagues to make sure that the current RTA plan is completely fulfilled, that we keep our commitments to the voters that we made back in 2006, and to work with all of you and with all of our other partners to get an RTA next plan in front of the voters to cover the next 20-year period. And then the second role that I feel that I have is to be the voice for not just my colleagues on the board, but for all of Pima County government. So I want you to know that anytime I'm coming into an RTA board meeting or a PAG Regional Council meeting, I'm not here just to express what Rex Scott thinks or what Rex Scott believes. I've had conversations with county staff, and can't talk too much to the other supervisors because of that darned open meeting law that all of you are familiar with as well. But just want you to know that those are the 2 things that I think are my chief responsibilities in this role, is to finalize the current RTA plan, get a new one in front of the voters, and to be the voice for Pima County government in these 2 entities. And then also wanted to mention why I feel the board, the RTA board that is, unanimously approved the motion that I made at our last meeting. Some of you know that before I ran for the board that I was an educator, that I was a teacher and a principal in our public schools. One thing I never was a science teacher, but I do understand what symbiosis is. And when I was having a meeting with your leadership, Tom and Carolyn and Mary, the day before the RTA board meeting, we talked about the symbiotic relationship that exists between the CAC and the TMC. And so heading into the last RTA board meeting, I was taking into account input that I had gotten from the two county TMC representatives, County Administrator Lesher and Deputy County Administrator DeBonis, about information that they were hoping to get, the entire TMC was hoping to get, not only from PAG RTA staff, but also from ADOT staff, so that they could then move forward with providing all of you some more precise guidance and directions so that you could complete your work. So we passed at our last meeting a very specific motion, and I want to read it to all of you because I had a conversation with Tom yesterday about this motion and how it was received by the CAC. And Tom, paraphrasing what you said, I think your perception was that some of the CAC members said, well, it's kind of consistent with what their expectations of us have been all along. And that's not exactly the case. The motion really came from not only what I was hearing from our TMC members about what the TMC needed more of, but it also came out of the meeting I had with your three leaders about what the CAC was hoping to get from the TMC. So the motion says the following: a motion directing PAG RTA staff to provide the TMC and CAC with all information necessary to make recommendations to the RTA board on the roadway element, such as the previously requested ADOT project funding scenarios. Now I'm going to stop there. That's the first half of the motion. And as you saw from the memo that the CAC got from Mr. Mogimi on Friday, and certainly this is consistent with what I heard from Ms. Lesher and Mr. DeBonis, I think the TMC really addressed very thoroughly the first part of that motion in their last meeting. And my understanding is that there is going to be a special TMC meeting, and then there will be the regular May TMC meeting, and all of this is before the RTA board meets again at the end of May. But the second half of this motion says, and to enable the TMC and CAC to have a comprehensive discussion and make recommendations to the RTA board on all RTA plan elements: roadway, transit, safety, environmental, and economic vitality. And so my feeling is that the TMC is likely to take up in more substance than they did in their last week's meeting, the second half of that motion in subsequent meetings. And that can only be to the benefit not only of the work that they're doing, but then the guidance and direction that they're giving to all of you. The other thing I wanted to say, and I didn't know this until Tom brought it up to me yesterday, is that the CAC used to have two members of the TMC who would attend on a regular basis, Mr. Bernal and Mr. Rosema. And for a variety of reasons, they've not been able to take part in your meetings for the last several meetings.
Here at least.
Actually, Terry does call in. John was the one that hasn't been able to join us.
And I know that Chair McGovern has mentioned this to Mr. Ortega with the TMC, and I just wanted all of you to know I will follow up with Mr. Ortega and Ms. Lesher, because I think that would be beneficial for you to have that ongoing contact with TMC members.
I think you just did. Mr. Ortega is on the call.
Hey, all right. Hi, Mike.
Hello, sir.
Terry called in as well, right?
Yeah.
Terry's been attending all along.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I just wanted to say it in closing, and then I am happy to answer any questions that any member has. And as I told Chair McGovern, I'm going to stay for the entire meeting. I just want to say moving forward that symbiotic relationship between the TMC and the CAC is recognized by the entire RTA board. That's why that motion was unanimously approved. I think we're making some strong progress, but we are always open to, as individual members, as an entire RTA board, we're always open into hearing input and concerns from CAC members. So those were my opening comments, Mr. Chair McGovern, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you or any of your colleagues have.
Thanks so much. I would open to the rest of the committee if you have specific questions or comments for Supervisor Scott. And as comments come up during the meeting, I'm happy that he will be here for at least most of the meeting, if not all of it. And
I'll stay for the whole thing.
And we'll invite him to jump in whenever the spirit moves you.
Thank you.
Bruce.
Supervisor Scott, thank you very much for your comments. Just your last point about the TMC. I think it's not only important that they're here, but we really need to hear their arguments, their rationale, their discussion as to why they've arrived at the recommendations and suggestions that they're bringing forward. Typically, those are presented to us by staff, but it would be really be helpful to us to have that conversation with them and really understand what's going into their decision making, their suggestions, their recommendations. And, we've gone back and forth on some items, but there have been a couple of times where we've raised questions to present to TMC, but we haven't necessarily heard directly back the response from the committee.
And thank you, Mr. Wright. And I think that having TMC liaisons attending CAC meetings would be helpful for you and your colleagues to get the story behind the recommendations that they make. I also think that there was great benefit back when the TMC had their all-day meeting that Chair McGovern and Vice Chair Campbell and Barris were there for the entire day, correct? You weren't? Okay.
No, I had a never mind.
I got called away.
I got it. All right. But I think again, going back to that whole concept of symbiosis, I think as much interplay as there is between TMC members and CAC members, it's to the better. And if there were ever value on the part of the feelings of the members of both bodies to have a joint meeting, I think that would be tremendous if it would help us to move things forward.
Thanks for that. I might just toss in for everyone's benefit that the TMC meeting from day before yesterday,
Last week.
last week, only feels like that, is online, and some really interesting conversations that I think will help you folks as well understand kind of some of the nuances of the questions we have in front of us.
And I had a debriefing meeting with Mr. DeBonis and Ms. Lesher after that TMC meeting, and they both felt very positive about how it had progressed. And Mr. DeBonis made special point to make reference to the use of RMAP data that was really helpful to the TMC in terms of the deliberations that they engaged in.
Thank you. Since Mr. Ortega is online, I wondered if he had any comments to share or questions for the supervisor.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. And thanks for, again, echoing Supervisor Scott's comments. Thanks to everyone for participating and spending the time really developing this important program. And it's great to see everybody working together to come up with something that's going to resonate with the voters. What I would suggest to you is a couple things. I don't really have any questions, but I do think that there will be hopefully some movement in terms of the structure of projects particularly. I think there was a really good conversation about that. I kind of whittle it down to what I'll call rescoping of some of the projects that I think could help in terms of reducing the cost of those named projects. Ultimately, the focus and where we started to lean and started to move towards was a focus on safety at intersections. I say that to you not to delve into all the detail, but I think that it does give an opportunity for us to really start to bring some clarity on what needs to happen, at least in terms of when you have scarce resource, you try to get the biggest bang for the buck. I did hear loud and clear, Supervisor, and I had spoken with Tom as well about another participant or liaison from the TMs to the CAC. I'll bring that up at our next meeting, and we'll chat through that because I do think you're right. The more interaction and cooperation we have between the two groups, not only in interpreting what each other is saying, but also bringing back the knowledge, that is very helpful. So happy to move that forward. Tom, I'm going to have to bug out here. I just wanted to still join back and forth as I can during the afternoon. So when you see me on, feel free to call me, okay? Or call on me.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us for the time you did and for your comments. Appreciate it.
Well, let's see if Terry has anything to add since he's been attending the meetings.
That's right where I was going. Terry, I hope you don't feel like I've thrown you under the bus by suggesting that another, not a replacement for you, but a teammate for you to our meetings would be helpful.
Hey, Tom. Yeah, thanks so much. I do appreciate. My wife says I'm irreplaceable, so I don't know that I'm replaced or not. But I do appreciate the opportunity. I have been trying to attend as much as I can. You know, I will say that sometimes it's difficult, and I have to jump in and out in order to do that. Always here to answer any questions, you know, with regard to the TMC side of things and what those discussions entail. You know, hopefully, you know, with the information that's being relayed from staff there, you're getting most of that. But if there's things that you need clarification on, that's absolutely why I jump on the call. So if there are questions that you have specifically from me or of me, I'm there to answer those for you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Chair McGovern, I'm wondering if I could ask both Mr. Ortega and Mr. Rosema. My understanding is, as a follow-up to the memo that the CAC got from Mr. Mogimi about the decisions that were made by the TMC in terms of winnowing down the roadway projects, that there's going to be some continued discussion between staffs of some of the jurisdictions so that that list can be even more flushed out, if you will. And I wondered if either you or Mr. Ortega wanted to comment on that, especially given what Mr. Wright said about having some more understanding of TMC discussions.
I think Mike left us. Aha, there he is.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor, I'm not sure I understood your question exactly. Are you asking if the jurisdictions will be looking at the information that is part of that rethinking and that will call change? Is that your question? I'm sorry.
It was exactly. Yes, sir. I'm glad you summarized it more artfully than I asked it.
No, sir. I think it was, I grasped it and got it. So I think the answer to that is yes. On behalf of the city of Tucson, I think the county staff, your staff is probably going to do something similar. I think the concern that I raised was if there is just a cutting of the or the project list, that could be problematic, but certainly a rescoping and again, a focus on return on is worthy of not only exploration, but also consideration going forward. So the staff at the City of Tucson will be looking at our projects starting at the bottom, if you will, of the list. And it's my understanding that those were priorities, and I'm not sure the exact terminology on how those priorities were established. Those were CAC, TMC, agency, or a combination of those, which is fine and okay. But I think ultimately want to make sure that our folks are weighing in on the technical side of what does that return on investment look like if we have to scale back those scopes. So that's for me, and I assume that the other agencies are going to do something similar, Supervisor, but I wouldn't feel comfortable answering for them at this point.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks. We have a couple of hands up in the audience. Joanne Sabat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Supervisor Smith, as an accountant, a public accountant here in Tucson, working with small businesses, also being a small business owner, sometimes I feel that the Board of Supervisors is tone deaf when it comes to increasing the TPT tax. We have the City of Tucson looking for more money. The Tucson Electric Power wants a 12% hike in addition to, I believe it's Prop 416 that's coming up in May. Has the Board of Supervisors really had a candid conversation on what they believe the economy in Tucson and Pima County can actually withstand?
I think we're always, Ms. Sabah, very sensitive to the fact that the only sales tax that county residents pay is the half-cent sales tax that that funds the RTA. I know that we're also, when it comes to the primary property tax and the 3 secondary property taxes, that we're considering not only the other property taxing entities within the county, the school districts, the fire districts, Pima Community College, Central Arizona Water Conservation District, but also the increase in valuations that lead to increased bills no matter what people's rates might be. So I think we take all of those things into consideration when we are looking at the levies the taxes that we are responsible for. I hope that was responsive to your question.
It is. Thank you very much, Supervisor Smith.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Sabah.
All right. Ava Romero.
Yes, thank you again, Supervisor Scott, for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have you here. And I just think this cross-pollination is always really helpful in terms of hearing directly from
more science terms. I love it. Thank you.
So I was wondering if it would be possible for us to bring up the revised plan based on the April 12 recommendations, because a number of the projects that are my favorites are not on the list anymore. You know, I live in the west side of Tucson, La Cholla Boulevard, Star Pass to Ajo Way, certain Mission Road segments, St. Mary's Silverville Roads, I-10. So can we pull that up and have a discussion of some of these projects that were cut, especially because these are, to me, you know, being from the west side, really high on the equity score. And if we were to actually, you know, take a look at the original priority list that we determined using the tools that we prepared, some of these projects that have been cut were high on the priorities.
And Ms. Romero, just before the chair brings up that document, your question is, and Mr. Wright's question actually, or why I posed the question that I did to Mr. Ortega and Mr. Rosema, because that memorandum that all of you got dated April 12th really is, I think, just the first iteration, because I know the term iterative process is one that we're all using a lot in all of these meetings. I think that what you got was just the first iteration of the work that the TMC is engaging in. So I certainly wouldn't see anything on that memorandum as written in stone, given the follow-up work that Mr. Ortega referred to, that's being done by the jurisdictional staffs, and also the continuing dialogue that's going to be occurring amongst TMC members.
That's great. It would be wonderful to have some of those cut projects to appear when these kinds of working drafts come out, so that we don't lose sight of anything.
Yeah, and Ava, if we could follow up, we're not really able today to go through those. And in fact, I'd like to hear back from this second meeting that the TMC has. And then for us to spend a meeting going over those named projects, because as you know, we're $300 million over the initial budget, and their input will be helpful to us. But at the same time, we want to capture those projects that you and any other members are concerned about not having made the list. So if I could suggest that you forward those to Paki with just kind of a so we can compile that list if there's a list beyond what we have now, so that when we do talk about these individual named projects, we're sure not to lose any of the history, and be sure that we're as thorough as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair.
Can I have a follow-up on that? Oh,
I was just going to say, Paki has a good presentation that hopefully was anticipating some of these questions. Maybe we'll allow her to go first, and then hopefully she'll touch on some of these things with her presentation.
well, I wanted to ask a follow-up question on that conversation, because I was at the TMC meeting, and there was an assumption by the TMC that they were numbered 1 through 37, in like 1 is the most important and 37 is like the bottom priority, but I don't recall us doing that. You put together this ballot. Can you explain to everybody? Because what the motion did was they started at the bottom and started trying to cut things from the bottom, assuming that that was the priority, prioritized numerically list. So can you explain that, the list numbering?
So we've had questions from a couple of the TMC members since then. We're going to allow them to answer that question at their next meeting, so you understand their philosophy, their logic for the recommendation they made. As you all know, there was an extensive process developing that list. So it wasn't from any one priority. It was CAC, TMC, then kind of look for what's missing. Let's add a few things. So it's a combination of efforts that led to that list. But since I had that question from some of the TMC members, I told them, why don't you all try to answer that at the next meeting? So we'll bring that back to you when they do.
Well, I'm sorry. My question was to you. What was who put together number 1 through 37 when they showed up on the ballot?
That's a combination of all those efforts. So it is taking all those CAC, TMC, add-ons. But we'll allow them to have that conversation so they can answer that question.
Right, and we will get to Paki. I just have one last question for Supervisor Scott from Abby Okran.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. And yeah, thank you, Supervisor Scott. Thank you, Mr. Ortega, for being on. I think this is going to basically restate the question that Carolyn just asked, but it is my understanding that that list 1 through 37 was not based on priority rankings. Mr. Mogimi, I don't understand what you're saying when you say that it's a combination of factors. We got a memo from Mayor Honey telling us that we need to do transportation corridor priority ranking. It cited a statute, Arizona Revised Statute 485311. I'm looking at that right now, as of course I am. And it says, through the regional planning agency, the county and municipalities in the county shall list transportation corridors by priority in the regional transportation plan. We have not made any priority lists. And every time we've had conversations about projects that we want to see advanced or discussed by the board, every single one of our conversations within the CAC, we've never prioritized that list. And we've also never even said that was a final list. I think every conversation has ended with someone saying, yeah, but can we revisit this? We don't necessarily want to remove these projects permanently or add these projects permanently. So I'm very concerned that at the TMC meeting this past week, I believe it was Mr. Bernal, expressed the understanding that the ranks 1 through 37 was a CAC priority ranking, allowing logically cuts to start at the bottom. Well, those happen to be Tucson projects. So I'm very concerned that the list wasn't prioritized, and also that it looks like Tucson projects were all cut now. I don't.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Did you have a question for the supervisor? Because we will get into all these things you're talking about in much more detail.
I don't have any questions for Supervisor Scott. No.
Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you
thanks
for
the
being
comments. We've captured those. We'll definitely address them. Okay, Pocky, do you want Supervisor again? Thanks for being here and
Happy to be here.
Your comments and for fielding questions.
And just aligned with Ms. Okrent's question, I mentioned that I had a significant debriefing conversation with Mr. DeBonis and Ms. Lesher after the last TMC meeting, and their understanding was that when the TMC had its all-day meeting, and the three of you were there, that was when those projects were listed in priority order. And so Mr. Bernal's motion to work from the bottom up was based on that understanding that was developed from that all-day meeting. So that was what was reported to me, but I'm seeing both Mary and Carolyn shaking their heads. So clearly there needs to be more conversation, not only about that motion, but how we move forward from it. And again, I think what Mr. Ortega said is being done by jurisdictional staff heading into the next 2 TMC meetings is going to help to address some of those issues.
So, Mr. Chair, we'll be happy to follow up with an email, but as you all recall, we had the TMC workshop results that was combined with the CAC scoring results. And then we came back and we said, what's missing? So you all, with feedback from the TMC, you added projects. So the ultimate list was a combination of those efforts. TMC had a scoring criteria that they used. CAC had a scoring criteria that they used as well. So combination of all those efforts brought us to where we are today. Just make sure everybody has that information. But we'll follow up with an email to remind everybody of those steps.
Yeah, and the process that the TMC is planning to take will also address that by going up into the list for projects that perhaps at least that group believes should be put into the lower priority list. So let's pin in that for right now and get back to it at the right time.
Tom?
Do you want to go ahead? I'm sorry, Mas, and if I see that you have your hands up, let me get to Pocky's presentation. It's a very short one, and we will. Is it a short one?
I'll try to be.
No. And then you guys will be first up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Supervisor Scott, for being here.
Thank you.
Some of these slides are repetitive, so I'm not going to go through them too much. I just wanted to highlight a few things on this topic, which is the categorical elements, and then we'll explain a little bit about the TMC recommendations. So the RTA next revenue of 2.3 billion, 1.9 is available for new investments, and we still have 790 million available for categorical elements. One of the things we wanted to just emphasize is the buckets. These are buckets of flexible funds and their investments. Voters are not going to be asked to approve how many projects or which projects. They're going to be asked to approve a budget for categorical elements. Just as a reminder of what you're going to be looking at today. As you all know, and as Tom mentioned, the draft plan was 300 million over budget from that named project list. At the April 12th TMC meeting, there was a recommendation to reduce the named projects to balance it to the 1.1 billion. What this does is proposes increases intersection improvement sub element under the safety element. And we'll go through that. I'm going to show you the blue slides are the ones that you've been seeing all along. So just as a recap, and then I used a different color code for the optional slides, just so you know where you're headed or where we think you're headed. So the environmental element that you talked about last time included the greenways, et cetera, and the wildlife linkages. Staff had proposed 70 million for the greenway sub-element and 30 million for the wildlife linkages for a total of 100 million. The options that were discussed at the last CAC meeting included the 3 following elements. And just to recap again, this was originally called the environmental and economic vitality element that the RTA board allotted 110 million for. That's 5.8% of the 1.9 billion. So the options that you had shared and that we are sharing back with you is the active transportation element. This would include 2 sub-elements. One is the greenways sub-element and the other one is the pedestrian safety improvements. And I'll go through these in more detail. The second one was the environmental element where we would put the critical wildlife linkages in there, and then the suggestion to include roadway related infrastructure enhancements. And then the discussion to move the RTA, to move the small business assistance under the RTA administrative costs. So under the active transportation element, the first sub-element is greenways, pathways, bikeways, sidewalks. Again, recapping what the RMAP needs are, the needs are 334 million for pedestrian facilities and sidewalk gaps. The cost per mile are roughly 12-foot multi-use paths are approximately 500 to 750,000 a mile. 5-foot sidewalks are about 500 to 750,000 per mile, and 6-foot bike lanes and paved shoulders are approximately 1 to 2 million per mile. Staff is proposing funding allocation of 70 million for this sub-element, which is roughly 100 miles. This meets 1/5 of the RMAP needs. The other sub-element under active transportation element are the pedestrian safety improvements. RMAP identified a safety remediation that's over $60 million of needs. We've got the Hawks that are approximately 350 to 500,000 each. Staff is proposing 20 million, which would give the plan about 50 Hawks. This meets about 1/3 of the identified funding needs. So this is what your new chart is looking like right now. Under the active transportation element, you've got the sub-element of greenways, pathways, bikeways, sidewalks, enhancements. We're proposing 70 million for that. And then the pedestrian safety improvements of 20 million. Now this, remember, has been pulled out of the safety element. So the total for this new element, active transportation, would be 90 million. The next element that was discussed was the environmental element. This is where the critical wildlife linkages would go. The RMAP needs for this are roughly 34 million. As I explained last time, cost per facility as a standalone project are about 5 million each. And per facility as a project element are as follows. Over crossings are about 2.5 to 7.5 million each. Under crossings about 1 to 3 million each. And fencing is about 500,000 to 1 million per mile. Staff is proposing 30 million, which meets almost all of the RMAP needs. Also under the environmental element was the discussion of roadway related infrastructure enhancements. Typically, these are included under the roadway improvement scope and not as a standalone activities. The RMAP does include these as part of named roadway projects, but not as standalone. So at this time, we're not recommending this to be a standalone sub-element. It really needs to be transportation related and regional to be eligible for RTA funding. However, I did do some research in the administrative code, and these could be considered as reimbursable items as part of the name project. So there's something there.
Sorry, was that what you renamed what we were talking about as green infrastructure? Is that?
Yeah, well, here, let me show you. Yeah, the name that came up was roadway related infrastructure enhancements is kind of what we came up with. So looking at the environmental element as a whole, we really just have the wildlife linkages in there for 30 million, and we're not recommending additional funding for the roadway related infrastructure enhancements for the reasons I just mentioned. So the total for this would be 30 million. So moving forward to the safety element, this is the original chart you had looked at last time, where you had 5 sub-elements: intersection improvements, pedestrian safety improvements, transit corridor bus pullouts, at-grade railroad safety, technology upgrades, for a total of 170 million. So 170 million, which is 9% of the 1.9 billion available. So here are some of the options that you discussed at the last meeting. Take 4 of those sub-elements under safety. The intersection safety and capacity improvements, leave that under there. Transit corridor bus pullouts was discussed as either leaving it there, or because they are safety related, or they could move under transit if necessary. The at-grade railroad safety would also belong under the safety element, and the technology upgrades. Those that are non-safety related items may be outside the scope of the RTA. So if they're only those that would be transportation related would fall under this. So the intersection safety and capacity improvements, RMAP identified region-wide intersection safety improvements of 50 million. There was an additional 64 congested intersections that had a low level of service, E or F. Intersection reconstruction costs were approximately 1 to 5 million. At the TMC meeting that I mentioned last week, the additional allocations for congestion reduction or capacity improvements, that was discussed in terms of how they cut the project list. So by removing the projects at the bottom that we discussed earlier, there were 7 additional intersections that remained that could be of savings from those projects that were cut. And those adjustments is what would go into the safety element. So what we're proposing is to fund this allocation for 90 million, which would be about 37 intersections. And it would meet all of the almost all of the RMAP identified intersection safety funding needs, and about half of the capacity improvements. Also under this element, you would have the transit corridor bus pullouts. RMAP identified 25 million for the bus pullout needs, and they have been well received based on public feedback. The cost per each bus pullout is about 500,000 each. Staff is proposing funding allocation of 10 million, which would be about 20 more bus pullouts. This meets about 2/5 of the RMAP identified funding needs. The other sub-element under safety would be the at-grade railroad safety. The average cost for projects at-grade railroad safety are approximately 500,000 each. Staff is proposing funding this for 10 million, which would give you about 20 at-grade railroad safety projects. And then the final sub-element under safety.
Excuse me, do you have an idea of the needs? I don't really know how many arterial roads are having at-grade railroad crossings today.
Mr. Chair, we do have a list of how many, but which ones need safety improvements. It was not broken down to that level. But from experience, I can tell you all of them could use some help.
So it says 20 projects. Is that more or less how many there are total in the
Atwood crossings?
community?
No, there's more than that. I don't know off the top of my head how many, but there's more.
For 10 million.
Yeah, well, I know there's dozens and dozens of them that have minor street crossings that probably don't rise to the regional level, but I'm just curious about.
Yeah, we can pull that number off of our information, but 20 would address the more regional ones.
And then under safety, we have the technology upgrades discussion. RMAP identified 99 million in signalization technology upgrades. 65 of that would go for arterial traffic management systems, and then 34 million would go for transit communications and signalization. So staff is proposing an allocation of 60 million for technology upgrades, which would meet about 2/3 of the RMAP funding needs. So this is what your new safety element would look like based on the discussion. You have 4 sub-elements: the intersection safety and capacity. And again, this is where the new intersections have been added. So that raises it to 90 million. The transit corridor bus pullouts for 10. And I know we're recommending keeping it under the safety element. However, you as a committee can decide whether you want to move it under transit. The at-grade railroad safety for 10 million, and then technology upgrades for 60 million. And we recommend keeping this under safety element as a safety need.
So, Paki, up on the intersection safety and capacity improvements, this 70 million includes an extra, how much was it?
20.
Okay, just to remind everyone in case it got past you, the TMC is evaluating its recommendations about which projects to cut. The idea being, if they were just to cut from number 37 up to number 25, that several of those projects that were lost may have problem intersections that need to be addressed, or should be addressed, and that extra amount would go toward those intersections. But if the way that they ultimately come back to us recommends that, half of those bottom 12 be cut and some others from further up get cut, that could change then both the number of intersections and specifically which ones might be needed in this area. So just as a placeholder, I understand the extra 20 million to make it 90.
Thanks, Tom, for explaining that. And then the other discussion that we held was moving the small business assistant, which used to be under economic vitality, and just moving that under administrative cost element. RMAP did identify 18 million of investments for business assistance between now and 2045 for RMAP projects. So the cost for this business support service is not included in individual named projects. Staff is proposing to fund 10 million for this administrative cost. It does meet RTA next needs based on the final list of named projects. If this item is not fully funded, then the small business assistant service before and during project construction would not be rendered. It's just something to keep in mind. So this is what the administrative cost element would look like for the small business assistant at 10 million.
That would be the only thing under administrative. Is one item.
It's $100 million.
No, from the categoricals that you've been looking at.
But it's not the full, and that's not gonna be the full.
No, the full is
$100 million.
Yes.
Looks like you got a question here. I'm not
Yeah, I
happy
have
to
some
respond
online
to that.
also that are, but let's say, hang on, are you completed now?
I was going to go into transit, so it's up to you if you want me to take a breather
Yeah,
here.
let's hold on to transit for a few minutes. Okay, we have a few comments and questions, and I'd like to kind of get those on the table right now so that we can then get into these one by one and determine what we want to do. If we want to move them the way that we talked about last time, and that is being shown by staff here. And if we're satisfied with the numbers that are either recommended by staff or from our previous conversations. So let me start with Moss.
Thanks, Tom. So I want to take us back to the conversation we were having at the last meeting, which was incredibly productive. So thanks all for your thoughts on that. I did some more organizing of information about kind of a proposed budget and categorical breakout from the CAC. And I wanted to offer to share my screen and use that as a way for us to work through what these budgets amounts are. I just want to first give some background to folks because I know it's been a lot, and it could be helpful to hear kind of what we've been empowered to do. Rex, thanks so much for your motion. I think it's really just reinforces this. But also back in November, the RTA board gave us direction to, the board gave us general direction on the budget and categorical. Specifically, Honey said that, the RTA 1 bucket breakdown, which is what we're seeing here, can be as a starting point. But really the specifics that we were given that we had to work from was that 2.3 billion was our total budget target, and that about 1.1 billion would be our target for named projects generally. So I know many of us have asked for it, and for an opportunity to present the CMC and RTA board with our own draft budget and proposed categoricals for RTA Next that isn't necessarily just a copy paste slight minute tweaking of RTA 1. So with that,
we have that. Thank you for supplying it to us, and we will get to that. I want to get these other questions out and then let you walk through your proposal.
Okay.
And we have it here to put up, so we don't have to go through the screen sharing process.
Perfect.
Thank you. Mine's a super simple, just clarity question on the small business assistant of 10 million. So that still comes from the 0.5 sales tax increase. It is simply put in the administrative bucket.
Yes,
But we still have that assistance.
Mr. Chair, and Edmund, that is correct.
Excellent.
Good. Arlen.
Yeah, my question is also simple, and I may have just missed it. In the safety element, what was the elderly and pedestrian safety improvements? What happened to that? Where did it go?
So, Mr. Chair, I can help remind everybody, and we can go back to that slide. So if you recall, at the last meeting, there was a conversation to have that as a separate active transportation line item.
Okay, so
but you can name it anything you like to name it.
Okay, and that when it didn't show up in safety, and then I figured it was somewhere else.
It's under active transportation.
That was it.
And that's the reason that we'll go back through these individually because that was a lot, and Bucky's went through it quickly for us, although much of it by now is getting used to it. I didn't mean it that way. I just meant we're getting used to the numbers. We've seen them before.
Yes.
Okay, Moss, since your proposal has the transit in it, I think maybe we should go ahead and get a summary of what's happening with transit. Just to let you know, the transit committee has met again, and it's time for this to come to the full committee for conversation. There's been a lot of debate and discussion, but I don't think the committee was able really to come to a full recommendation to the committee. So now is the appropriate time for us to be looking at it ourselves as a full committee. Want to go ahead and talk to you?
Yeah, thank you, Mr.
Show
Chair.
us at least where we are at this point.
And I also want to thank the regional RTA Transit Working Group members. They've all been attending these meetings and providing some valuable information to the subcommittee. So at the last meeting, the city of Tucson actually did a very informative transit presentation. And that's what kind of brought on the discussion. As Tom mentioned, the subcommittee hasn't been able to move forward with any recommendations. However, they did make a request, which I've put on this screen slide for you. We're showing you the adopted percentage, and we're also showing you the current funding amount forecasted and what's currently being used. So for example, the weekday evening bus service, the subcommittee had originally allocated 15% for this. Right now, the funding allocation breakdown amount is about 76.5 million. The current funding amount that's forecasted through the end of the RTA is 43 million, which is so about 12% of this sub-element is currently being used. For weekend bus service, 10% has been allocated and about 7% is being used. For bus frequency, 17% has been allocated for this sub-element for a total of 86.8 million, and about 21% is currently being used. The transit services for elderly and disabled, and I know there was a discussion to change this sub-element name. I'm just still using the ones that haven't moved forward. 31% is the percentage allocated to this sub-element. About 32% of that is currently being used. That's forecasted for 2026. Same with also for the neighborhood circulator bus systems, 15% been allocated, 12% is being used. Express service, 5% was allocated, and about 7% is being used. Service area expansion, 7% was allocated, and we still are looking at 9% to be used. So this brings you to the total of which is what the board allocated for this element of 510 million. So this is the discussion that we wanted to also bring forward to you today.
Thanks. Okay, Crystal, could you, or Bruce?
This is just my ignorance, but maybe you can help me with it. It's, as I understood the discussion earlier on the roadway projects and even most of the categoricals, we have to use that for capital expenditures and not for operational and maintenance expenditures by and large. But on this one, it seems to me the rationale is very different. We're primarily using it for operational and less for capital. Is that a fair representation at this point? And is that a difference that's defined in law, or how is that happening?
Mr. Chair, Bruce, good way of kind of categorizing it. You're almost there, 90%. The 10% difference is that RTA can use funds for operation and maintenance of anything that the RTA owns, not if it's owned by another municipality. So typically with most of the projects, they're owned by a different entity through an IGA. RTA will pay for those improvements. And those improvements have to be either construction or reconstruction, not operation and maintenance. So to answer your question.
And once those projects are completed, they revert in total to those jurisdictions who are then responsible in perpetuity for the maintenance of them. The
Correct.
difference, as he said here, is kind of ownership and continuing ownership. Good. Okay. Crystal, could you put up Moss's spreadsheet, I guess? And I'm certain that at least for the people in the room, we'll have to focus in on individual sections of it and see if you can enlarge those as we go. But Moss, before we launch into it, I wanted to try to keep these broken down also the way that we've been presented them today. So if you could give us an overview of your 4 comparison areas, and then walk us just quickly through the proposal. Then we'll go back and we'll start picking them up individually, and as part of that, we can flip back and forth to this if you like, when you make your case for those individual sub-elements. Does that make sense to you?
I guess so. I mean, I think one thing that this doesn't have are sub-elements, in part because I just feel like we really haven't pinned down what the core elements are at this time. So I was approaching this in the sense of like, okay, what is our overall budget, which you can see there in the top left corner. And then from there, I took out the RTA 1 projects that will be undelivered at the time of that funding period ends. So it's that 230 million. And then that leaves us taking off the topics. I think that's what we had all discussed at some of the last meetings. And then from there, I took the remainder and said, what was the board guidance as far as named projects? That's that 1.1 billion. And then that leaves us with the 99 million for what I'm calling unnamed projects, or kind of like what we've been saying is the categorical funds that don't have anything specified as project wise.
So
And then
just to clarify, you're suggesting that that each of the categoricals include named projects?
that's correct. And a lot of that comes from, you know, discussions that, you know, I've heard you raise, Tom, and other folks have raised as far as what's so important about having named projects, and that it's shows to voters that it gives them something tangible to hold on, and saying, this is what we're going to see when we vote on this, and can guarantee that when it comes to active transportation, we're going to have X, Y, Z, whatever projects that are going to come through from this, and have that go through all these different priority areas. And that could be, so this could help satisfy business leaders who are like, what are those economic projects going to be? What are those tech projects? You know, environmentalists can be happy because they'll see, oh, this, you know, specific, you know, wildlife linkage, for example, is going to happen. Yay. And really giving everybody, voters throughout the region who's interested in different things, something specific to hold on to. So I think that's a really important part of this, because right now we have a really big imbalance of named roadway projects, but not anything else aside from, I think there's like maybe one or two public projects that might fall into the public transit element. So that was the rationale there.
All right, well, just another clarification. The multimodal roadways represents about half, I guess, or 60% maybe of the board's $1.12 billion budget, correct?
So
in other words, what you're doing is taking $500 million off of the named roadway projects and distributing them among these other areas.
Well, because the board never specified that the named projects had to be roadways. And so I took that as we just need to have 1.1 billion of named projects, as was the motion that Ed Honey made in that November meeting, so that we can ensure that we're investing in all of the needs. I think one thing that has been really helpful about staff's presentations lately is that they've been highlighting what our map says is the needs for all these different areas, right? And I really latched on to the one that the original proposal only had did 3% of the necessary bike or pedestrian infrastructure, whereas by restructuring this to align with what our map's actual spending allocations are, we're actually able to fund about 62% of the necessary pedestrian infrastructure as identified in our map. So that's where that came from. And just to orient folks a little bit more who haven't had huge amount of have only had this for a few minutes to look at, on the left side of the screen in that orangey color are each of the different, or like these 4 different categories or plans or things for us to kind of reference from the region. So the first quadrant is RTA 1, what was passed on the ballot and has been so far been implemented. Then below that is what the proposed ballot that we've seen most recently, and I guess I put the date wrong. It should be 3/17. That memo that we received that had that ballot in there. And then, so showing a little bit very similar to RTA 1, some differences. You could see some of those changes that have happened in RTA next. And then on the third quadrant on the top right, that's where our map is. So I just went directly to the RMAP plan, found the pie chart that breaks out how the different spending categories and what portion of the budget is going towards each of those. And then below that is the Move Tucson framework that Mike, I'm sure you can come talk about this better than I can, but just basically laying out, since the city of Tucson had this recent data-driven analysis and plan developed called Move Tucson that was done around the same time as our map, and showing how kind of those different categories fell into place. So as I noted at the top of the section that's in the green, it are largely based on RMAP, since this is a regional plan. And that was a plan that was, Farhad, I think you corrected or provided the information that the regional jurisdictions adopted this in 2020. It's data driven, all based on all this information. So it's a really great starting point for us to be thinking about current needs that need to be addressed, and especially thinking to 2045, right? Which it perfectly aligns with what RTA Next would be funding as well. So that was my logic, for basing this on there. And basically I kept everything the same as far as percentages. You'll notice on the very bottom of the RMAP section, there's a local fundings priorities, which was getting 25% of that pie. And since, right, we're doing regional funding, regional projects, I decided to take that 20% and kind of dispense it around some of these other areas. So this is my first pass based on kind of our conversations and hearing what I was thinking might be, satisfy CAC interests and concerns while also being grounded in the data-driven, RMAP study. So essentially we're getting, spending less on roadways, more on public transit, more on system maintenance. That would be a new element that would be created. We talked about active transportation and, at the last meeting, and we heard how that could be fit into the staff's proposal. And then safety technology. Bruce, I think you've been bringing that up a lot and been appreciative of your foresight in wanting to think about how we're making technological advances, improvements in this plan. And then also recognizing the discussions we've had as a CAC about really feeling that the economic and environmental pieces are separate components. And so, and then of course that discretionary fund that staff had set aside to try to allow for some flexibility within the plan, which we had talked about. So I cut that back from the 100 million just because 100 million was more than, like we could see that was more than some of the other elements that we were looking at, like safety. I just wanted to make sure that the discretionary fund wasn't getting more money than a specific element, if that makes sense. And so that's why that number looks a little bit different.
Okay, great.
And then based on those, just real one last little thing. Then based on those percentages, you get the total budget by element, and then that like 29% of that budget gets you. We'll get that. Right, I basically split up the 1.1 billion times that proportion of that budget to get to the named projects budget amount, and then for unnamed was just basically the remainder from that. So with this, we'd have a relatively balanced budget going into, and then we could be looking at projects and different things like that and making some decisions that way, rather than what I see is kind of working in reverse and building something up and then realizing we have too much money one place and whatnot. So this is just how my brain works, and I hope it's helpful, and happy to talk to folks and make adjustments if that's helpful to see.
Yeah, thanks very much. And it's a large amount of work here. We appreciate it. I'd like to let the committee review this and, kind of think about the differences here in philosophy with how RTA 1 was set and how RTA Next is currently being approached. And I think at our next meeting, we should settle some of those issues. One, I can tell you right now that won't be up to us to settle, and that's system maintenance. That's obviously something that the board will have to decide upon. But by the same token, if we have, and as I've told you all along, as we put our $2.34 billion plan together, once we have that completed, that is how we break it up the way that it's currently organized, we will, with the exception of those categories that we have changed, we will also make recommendations to the board regarding any of these policy issues that we think are important and upon which the CAC agrees, of course. So this will be, I'm certain, part of our conversation going forward with, all of the things that we're talking about. So everyone hang on to it, keep referring to it as we're going through our conversation today. I think, Farhad, did you want to?
I was going to respond to previous question that might be helpful for this conversation as well, if that's okay.
Sure.
Is that okay? So the question was the additional administrative cost pursuant to the legislation. 1% of the revenue is set aside for operation and maintenance and administrative cost of the business, right? As an organization, there's 1% cost. So that's set aside roughly $23 million. So I'm trying to get down to the rest of that list. And then in addition to that, and we did this with the previous RTA plan, bonding capacity and debt service cost in order for the RTA governing body, and at the time, obviously, we felt that we wanted to deliver some of these larger projects earlier in the program. So the desire was to bond for these projects and be able to deliver within the first 5 years of the plan. And we propose to do the same thing for RTA Next. Be able to bond and deliver a majority of projects, especially the deferred projects in the first 5 years. And obviously it costs money if you borrow money. So we're anticipating about $77 million for debt service. So that's itemized as well in that draft that you received from me last Friday. So 77 million for debt service capacity. Without it, we won't be able to bond, obviously. So that's a decision for the board to make. We got the $23 million for operations of RTA, 1% of the total revenue. And then the $10 million is separate, and that's for the Main Street program. And as Paki mentioned, that is a program that's well received by a lot of our businesses. And assuming that you have over $1 billion worth of main projects, that $10 million is a reasonable number based on the RMAP numbers. Hopefully that answers your question.
I guess my suggestion would be just to have it listed on the slide.
So you have it on this handout, but we'll make sure we'll include it in future presentations as well. So that is that capacity for bonding. Obviously, it's a policy decision. My recommendation to the board will be to maintain that capacity for bonding. If we don't, then we're kind of on a pay-as-you-go process, which we don't want projects to wait 10, 15 years before you actually have the savings to deliver those projects.
Maybe at a penny, we wouldn't need the money.
Conversation.
All right, good. Let's use what we've just been talking about and take a look at these individual elements, the categories themselves. This category, which we are proposing to add, is active transportation. And we have the numbers you see up there as proposed, and perhaps a beginning spot. Now, the pedestrian safety improvements, we have moved over, as to remind you, we've moved them over from the, what we call before, the safety element. So, right, any comments about the relative balance of these and or the amount of the need, which will be hopefully satisfying with the numbers that you see there. Remembering that the greenways only covers about 1/5 of the overall need, but is a large improvement over what we'll have spent on RTA 1. We'll have spent, nearly 30 million, and proposal here is 70. Whereas with pedestrian safety, it's a 50% increase in today's numbers, or in today's dollars. But the ped safety program, as shown here, would meet about 1/3 of the regional need. So any comments? Bruce?
Yeah, my only observation on the pet safety is that is an acute problem currently facing our community right now. I recognize that this is nearly a 50% increase, but I just wonder how we are addressing what seems to be a crisis right now in terms of pedestrian safety. And maybe this requires maybe a disproportionate allocation to address that problem. So I don't have a solution for it or amount to just an observation.
Okay, and a reminder from what Moss was proposing, she has a 10% allocation or $211 million. Whereas what we're looking at here is at 90 million, so less than half of that. Moss, do you want to tell us what you're thinking about the active transportation?
Yeah.
Does not include the pedestrian safety though, which would or perhaps it does. I'm not sure.
So this is where, yes, I mean, I still think that like the 90 million here, right? If we're just saying like that's going to have, that's just, it's pennies compared to what, we're seeing is a need in our map. And Tom, I just wanted to offer another approach here, because I think it can be, especially since we don't have both options kind of together, we're talking about sub elements here versus elements elsewhere. I wanted to just offer that maybe we talk as a group first about whether there's a certain framework folks would like to start to operate within, rather than toggling between the two and trying to, say, oh, I like 70 million here or not, like, is there base that we could have like that framework, whether it's the proposal I sent around or with some tweaks to it, or continuing to work off of staff slides?
Well, I guess what I'm aiming for us to get to is understanding what percentage of whatever is allocated to these elements should be spent on those individual sub-elements. I think that's really important for us to understand how we're intending to divide the money, because we don't know what that actual money is going to turn out to be. Farhad?
Just want to clarify back to Bruce's question. The 20 million was under safety previously. At the last meeting, there was a request to move it. So the total safety element is much higher than that. If you don't mind, go back to the safety element, the green one.
The new one.
Yeah, so the green element for safety would be 170 plus that 20, so it'd be 190.
Where's the 20 being pulled from?
At the last meeting, there was a recommendation to move the 20 from safety to the active transportation. You can keep it under safety if that's easier.
That was for pedestrian.
Yeah, but you can keep it under here if that's easier to follow.
Mr. Chair, Edmund, yeah, so the pedestrian, it was discussed, seemed more like an active transportation type of activity. So the committee had proposed creating an active transportation element and moving it to there.
I'm going to agree with Moss if I was understanding exactly what she was saying. We're talking elements, we're talking sub-elements, like we haven't even figured out the buckets yet. Can we just talk elements and maybe not try to break? It's so confusing. Like we're trying to talk chapters here, but then somebody's talking about a paragraph. So like, can we get back to the book? We just need like one worksheet with the elements so we can just walk through elements. And plus, I mean, we're not the TMC.
I'm just trying to get the verbs here.
I'm with you.
I'm not getting up.
So let me help with that too, if I may. So let's do that just so everybody has the same information. So if we're talking about just elements, we had the roadway corridor elements at 1.1 billion.
Right.
And then there was a recommendation to create active transportation elements by itself. That would be at 90. If somebody can follow this, maybe I'll do it myself. And then you have safety at 170, correct?
Yes.
Can you slide those? Give me the green for safety, please.
Want
Want to
to
make
make
sure.
You want the ballot? Farha? That should-
Well, no, I want to make sure everybody has the most recent discussion. So you got environmental at 30 million. And then you have transit at 510. So those are elements. Correct? Can somebody check that for me, make sure we're right? So I'm trying to respond to your question.
I appreciate it.
So named projects at 1.1 billion.
Right.
Environmental at 30. Safety at 170. And then you got transit at 510. And then admin cost at 110.
110.
And then 90 is the only one that we were just looking at, which was the active transportation element. Thank you. That was actually a helpful question, I hope. So those are elements.
And that fits within our budget. Those
That fits
numbers.
within the budget. Those are the elements. Now, everything else underneath each one of those are sub-elements. And again, you can move those around with those budgets.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Farha, the total did not change for the whole categorical. It was just shifted around. And the original element, yeah, we did provide those to you earlier in the worksheet. I didn't think to do them again, sorry. But
It's
they're
pretty
changing.
confusing.
I know.
Okay, I hear you. Let's talk about the elements themselves, what those buckets are, and what we're feeling as a committee is good or bad about them, remembering that we're staying for now within the 2.34 billion. Voss has suggested a $611.9 billion or $1 million budget for multimodal roadways. Voss, are you saying that you've taken some of the 1.1 billion out of that and put it in other of these categories?
Yes, because the statutes and the board did not specify that the 1.1 had to go towards roadway projects. So that what, as I explained earlier, the rationale here is that everybody, every special interest group, the regional community members could be assured that there would be a name project for an element that we could all just, you know, you've said it many times, Tom, I think really well about how the importance of having name projects as far as a transparency measure and making sure voters know what they get. And so to me, I think it's the way I was thinking about it was just trying to spread that same rationale across the entire plan to all the elements. So that's that. And then, you know, it also came from some of our previous conversations. I think Carolyn, you brought this up a lot about how because of the budget shortfall for RTA 1, funds were getting swept from categoricals, you know, to help supplement named roadway projects to make sure that those got delivered. And so I think this would just be another way too, since I think, you know, especially in city of Tucson, I'm not sure if other communities are feeling this too. There's a lot of like anxiety around RTA next having a similar thing happen. So I think that this would really be an important thing for city of Tucson voters to see named projects in these other categories that are important and are reflective of the Move Tucson framework and RMAP to guarantee that those will get delivered rather than, you know, at the end of the, you know, next 2 decades getting funneled to spend to pay for these other projects because of, you know, inflation, whatever shortfalls in funding, which we all understand. So
We all live through that.
Oh yeah.
And I will say that I and others asked for specific projects that would elucidate what some of those individual sub-elements were consisting of. So in order to understand what a pedestrian safety improvement might be, could they name a project either from RTA 1 or one that didn't get funded in RTA 1 that would likely be a high priority or a typical kind of project? That's why we asked for that. But I would not agree that the board has not specified the $1.12 billion number as our budget for our starting point. Thanks for correcting it to Mayor Honey's wording, but that was their first direction to us, was to use that for those named corridor projects. And so as far as, you know, taking from those, again, that obviously would be something we would have to, as a committee, recommend to the board as we go through our process here. But percentages of these percentages of the sub elements is part of what I know we need to get to eventually, but right now we're talking about percentages of the elements, the actual categories. And we know that the 1.12 billion represents pretty close to 50% of the overall amount. So we're talking now with Moss of moving that to 25% or so, actually 29%. So each of these elements, and her elements are different from ours, but I want you to consider the percentages that we have within those, and talk to us as a committee about why you think that element is adequate or too much or inadequate. Sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, and can I just add one quick thing about this real quick? And Bruce, I'm sorry to jump in. I just wanted to clarify some things about the name projects. And actually, for one, I was hoping maybe Rex, since he was there, could clarify whether when we say named projects or when that motion just said named projects, if that's specific, if that should be like amended and specified to roadway projects, if that was that was what was meant. Because I also want to remind the CAC that back in November, both Paul Kiesler from Oro Valley and Catherine Skinner, and I have the quotes if folks want, where they said that they didn't think that they were asked to submit name projects for transit or any of the other categoricals, even though they were part of that consideration. I know we've seen memos where it was a bit generally, but we heard very recently that there was confusion about that request. And I think that this could be another opportunity to help to rectify that confusion. It happens. It's a big, messy process. And then that would also allow, you know, folks to just make sure that jurisdictions are getting all the projects that they need in there and having those names so they can really get buy-in from their voters.
Okay, that question did come up in the TMC meeting, and the TMC is looking at that. It appeared, though, from the responses I heard from the tape of that meeting, that no one was stepping forward saying that there were a bunch of projects they had that they didn't get to put in.
Mr. Chair, just a reminder, $4.6 billion worth of named projects were submitted. To this day, I have not heard from anybody else that they did not include anything that they wanted to include. Most recently at the transit sub-element committee, that question came up.
Yeah.
And they said they did not have anything else to submit. So I guess by way of defining whatever was submitted, $4.6 billion were named projects, and now we're getting down to 1.1, and that's the challenge here.
Right. Yeah. So, we're upset that things like greenways and pathways are only going to satisfy it, even at doubling or more than doubling the amount in RTA next, are only going to take care of 1/5 of the needs. That's about what we're talking about with the corridor roadway projects as well. So that's, you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul. And burn down his office. Edmund.
Hi, Bruce.
Oh, I'm sorry. Short-term memory loss. Sorry.
That's okay. So just a couple observations. I think we're at a really interesting point in this discussion. I think that what Pocky presented us today represents the culmination of the last 2 or 3 or 4 years of our work and lays out one approach to this whole plan. And I think what Moss has done is also very helpful. I like the comparison of the 4 different components and offering an alternative approach to this. For me, it would be helpful to lay these side by side for our next meeting and frame a discussion about how we really do want to approach these elements and their percentages and so on. I did look at this ahead of time, but I'm still trying to digest what Moss has put on and what the implications are for it. But I think that would be a useful conversation because we're going to have to come to some decision between different approaches and decide what we want to recommend. So I don't.
Yeah, and it's also the reason that I've been asking the committee for alternative plans, alternative approaches to bring to the full committee for vetting and discussion. And this one that came is great for us to dive into and compare side to side, as Bruce puts it, with our culmination plan, if you will.
My only other point is I think there are philosophical issues embedded in each of these 2 approaches that we have to sort through. As an example, the categoricals we have now do not specify named projects.
Right.
I support that right now because that gives us the discretion as things change over time to be able to move projects around in response to demand and technology and all the things we have. If we have named projects, then I would really propose that there have to be some kind of a 10-year review of named projects and give the board or set up a process for doing that review. So those are philosophical differences. And I think we need to start getting to those issues. And I think laying these side by side will allow us to sort of bring those out and have that kind of discussion. So that's my suggestion.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add, sorry, Edmund, that you're right, Bruce. When we talked about named projects before, we explained that that's what's going to be on the ballot. The buckets that we're talking about now are so flexible and it is an advantage. And if you think of what voters will look at versus a specific project, that's the balance of the ballot. So we had gone through all of that before. And then also just to add, I really appreciate Amanda Moss's work. Although we did not get an opportunity to view it before this meeting, and that's why it wasn't shared. There was no comparison because right now this is what I have to go on. Just wanted to clarify that.
And the reason that is completely on the head of the chair. I just dropped the ball and I apologize to the committee.
No worries. I just wanted the committee to know that we weren't doing anything with this issue.
Yeah. Edmund and then Ava.
I too appreciate the work that Moss put in. I agree with seeing the quads and that was very interesting. I appreciate that. I also think there's some advantage to us staying within the elements that the RTA board has put together. We have to keep in mind there's an RTA board, there's an RTA TMC. I think if we start creating different element categories, it's going to get even more confusing. I mentioned the example of chapters versus paragraphs. I didn't even got to the chapters yet. So I'm going to put a motion out there, which when seconded, I just want to say I am completely open to doing an adjustment to my motion as we have a discussion. But I think we need to start somewhere. I'd like to make a motion and recommend that we adopt the elements as follows. 1.12 billion for the roadway corridor, 90 million for active transportation, 170 million for safety element, 30 million for the environmental, 510 million for transit, and 110 million for debt service RTA admin costs. It's a starting point. And again, sub elements can be discussed later. I'm happy to adjust that. I just think we have to put something on the table and at least get to our elements so we can finally get to sub elements and name projects.
I guess I'll make a counter motion that we accept the elements that are spelled out in the proposal I sent, which is based on our map, rather than the elements that are based on the outdated RTA 1 plan.
So we have a second to Edmund's motion.
Moss, I think it's called a substitute motion and then that goes first.
Correct.
Substitute motion then. Thanks, Carolyn. Same words though.
Yeah, I'm not accepting the substitute motion.
You don't need to. A substitute motion, it just needs a second.
Correct. Okay.
I'll second a substitute motion. This is Ava.
Okay. Ava, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think that what I hear a lot these days is show me your budget and I'll show you your values. And I really think that the best way to win over the voters is to be able to speak with great specificity about how our project, about how our plan is addressing the crises that we're in terms of pedestrian deaths in our streets, in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of equity problems, in terms of inequitable usage of our roads. And if we can speak convincingly about that based on how we break down our categories, then we can get the public to come along. So I think it's a much stronger way to move forward.
Arlen?
I appreciate the effort to put in motions and to move it along. I'm not prepared to vote for either motion. I think there's some massaging that can be done here. Maybe look at these terminologies a little bit. What I was going to say prior to Edmund making the motion was that, excuse me, in Moss's document in terms of the elements, number one, I was going to suggest a couple of very simple changes, one of which is to reflect
now. We got to decide what we're doing and what documents we need.
Mel, you're not muted.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Arlen.
Okay. I was going to say that the carryover for projects, which are named projects, be reflected in, I believe, in what would be multimodal roadway sections in Moss's recommended categories. And then the second thing was that I think also in that the admin and debt service numbers that Farhad had talked about, the 1% and the 100 million in debt service needs to be accounted for and in effect taken off the top. So it's not really being divided up into other things. It's not shown here. There's this discretionary number, but I think that's important. Basically, you have to have some administrative cost to run a program, and you also I concur with the debt service comment. But I appreciate the effort to move this forward. But I think if we get to next week or next meeting and we get these sort of comparative things, it might help to flush out some of this stuff a little bit better. I think we're close.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't want to vote.
Yeah.
Carol. I agree. I'm not ready to support either motion since I still have some questions on Moss's list, although I like it. And I think it'll be good to have staff look at it too. I would rather, if we just proceed with the process that we've been talking about, which is to get a side-by-side and start delving into these more for at our next meeting, and Moss can answer more questions about exactly what she means by some of these. And I the named and the unnamed, that's something I would really need to think about in every category, about having those many named projects or bigger buckets. Although I will remind you, like I always do, when we talk about that being a big jump from 29 to 70, what was on the ballot and what the voters voted for was 60 million under greenways, pathways, bikeways, sidewalks. So that there's the other side of the flexibility element when the board makes a vote later on that they need all that flexible money to put into roads. It's not as big of a jump on all those categoricals as we talk about. I say that every time, but as one of the people that was involved in 2006, I feel a bit of an ownership of it. So, I mean, this is just the money that's actually being spent in those categories. So there are a couple of them actually that are less money than was on the 2006 budget. the other suggestion, I'm not going to make a motion, but this is a suggestion to think about it, since I think of active transportation as kind of environmental. And the only thing left in environmental now that we took out the business assistant and the economic part is perhaps the critical wildlife linkages could go under, I mean, it is active transportation, it's just not for humans. But it's a greenway or pathway. I don't know, I'm just trying to make it easier because I know you don't want to just see like one thing, one sub element. Anyway, just to think about that next time.
So there is a safety component to that element. So it could
Yeah,
go
or
under,
safety.
it could go under safety.
Or just have, one bucket in safety and
Well, it
double
was,
buckets.
safety was our number one priority.
Yeah, it is
Essentially,
definitely a
it's our
safety issue.
guiding principles.
Anyway, that's.
Okay. Any other comments? Bruce?
I'm with Carolyn and Arlen. I would move to table these two proposals and carry them over to our next meeting where we can see the side-by-side analysis and then take them back up at this point.
I have a second. All right. All those in favor?
Wait, don't we have to vote on the?
Actually,
No, there's a
Table
motion.
takes precedence.
Yeah, there's a motion to table and a second, so you take a vote on that first.
on tabling, yeah. All right. Those in favor of tabling and bringing this to our next meeting, say aye.
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 Any nays? Very good. Thank you. Well, until we have those together, it's time for us to, for the first time in 5 years, get out of
Wait.
here before our meeting is over.
Chairman Governor.
Please,
I'm
Supervisor,
not trying to
extend our meeting.
extend this or prevent you from setting a record for the first time in 5 years, but going back to some questions that were raised earlier in the meeting and going back to the whole premise for the motion that the RTA board passed, I would encourage you to collate whatever questions you have for the TMC, especially related to the elements going into their next meeting, because my understanding is that the elements are going to be a big focus of their next meeting. Is that correct, Mr. Mogimi?
Yes, and if you don't mind, I
Not at
want
all.
to add to that. Go ahead and
Please.
finish your thought. Then
No, I finished my questions. You go right ahead.
Yes, and it kind of goes back to a question that was raised earlier when we talked about not naming those categoricals. Even at the last TMC discussion, they felt that was critical to make sure that the future boards have that flexibility.
And and I appreciated earlier when Mr. Ortega said that there was going to be continued participation in CAC meetings by TMC liaisons. But I think if you have any specific questions or need for additional direction or guidance from the TMC going into those meetings, that it would be a good idea to ask it now, especially if it helps with that side-by-side comparison that you're going to have at your next meeting.
Very good. Very good comment. I might ask if anyone has any specifics to pass forward as questions or comments to the TMC that maybe haven't been expressed so far that Carrie can take back and or staff can communicate as well. Edmund?
I think to keep it simple, it'd be great if Terry could take back to the TMC both motions so they can compare both scenarios and then give us feedback on it. What's the reality of both?
Yeah, one of the drawbacks at this point is that staff has not reviewed it either, and I'd like for that to take place so that we have everyone's working with the same numbers and information off our map, et cetera.
For clarity.
So we'll do that for our next meeting.
Staff didn't see Moss's
No,
scenario.
the committee hasn't seen it either.
Right.
It's only come to Carolyn and Mary and I. So,
Okay, that makes sense.
although I've heard a few people saying that they have, I hope that's not true because it would certainly violate our open meeting laws to distribute that ahead of time. Bruce?
Going back to the TMC, I actually think we would really benefit of having a formal presentation at the next meeting from the TMC to give us an overview of where they are, what they're recommending and so on. I mean, we've had bits and pieces of it, but I just think it would be really helpful to have that, take the first half hour of our meeting and really understand where they are, what their recommendations are, their perspectives on it. And we could ask them questions because I feel like I'm getting bits and pieces of it and I don't have a real sense. They're the professionals, they're the engineers, they're the people that have to, where the rubber meets the road. I really want to hear what they have to say. And I don't feel like I have that knowledge.
Well, in defense of their process, they haven't gone completely through the entire plan either. So, they haven't dug into the categoricals either. Their focus right now is to try to get the named projects under control.
But even that would be important.
Yeah,
to understand.
no, I hear you exactly. I think it's a good idea.
Tom?
Yeah,
I have a
please.
couple thoughts.
Mr. Chair, Bruce, I was
Just
just
a
gonna,
second, Moss.
I was just gonna say that at the April 12th TMC meeting, we did share some of these slides with the TMC, so they got to see for the first time where the CAC was with the categoricals. Just so you know, that was the first time they got to see that. But they've been focusing on the named projects, as Tom said.
Good. Okay, Moss, go ahead.
Thanks. And I just have a couple of things. And I'll send it by email too for clearer documentation, but just so it's said for the public record. I wanted to request that staff, send by memo a couple questions that I've been stewing on and trying to find an answer to. Well, and first one would be, could these types of presentations that we saw today get included in the meeting minutes in advance of the meeting? I see that with other jurisdictions that if a staff is going to do a presentation, that's included in the agenda items so that folks can have time to digest and see what those are before kind of getting, looking at it for the first time and then being asked to ask questions. So for me, that would just be really helpful to see that. So I guess going forward, could all presentations from staff for a current meeting get included in the meeting minutes before the meeting? The next question I had was if staff could provide an inflation rate that the CAC can use when reviewing project costs, especially the named projects. I remember listening to a TMC meeting a few months back, and some of the jurisdiction leaders, the experts as we've been calling them, have been saying they've been seeing since 2019 when they submitted these project costs a 40% increase due to all the inflation. And so I just think it would be really helpful for us as we have these conversations to understand what factor we should be increasing them so that we're right sizing this plan for what we're actually able to spend or expect to be able to spend. Okay. The next question I had.
Oh wait, you're getting too many questions here.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Well, I said I'm happy to email them too as well, and I have some other. Tom, I can send them. I'm just wanted to make sure that
I'll come back to you. It's okay. I just don't want any of these other folks to not get a chance. That's all.
So, Mr. Chair, let me touch a couple of those. Again, TMC is focusing on updating cost estimates. We have a consultant who's doing that for us. So when we get that updated cost estimate, that'll all be included in the dialogue between TMC and the CAC. So that was the last part of the question. Stay tuned. We're working on that part. As far as coordination between TMC and CAC, that's the challenge. The packet goes out for CAC a week ahead of time. That was on Monday. TMC met on Wednesday. What you see is fresh off the printer based on what TMC discussed. So it's really difficult trying to make sure that we keep everybody updated, at least in the packet material. That's why we do it during the meeting. So I just want to touch on those two.
And
So on that though, but we
question
can,
about sending it by memo to the committee.
Yeah, so
as those things are.
so the memo you
together.
received from me on Friday was that attempt to get you updated with what TMC did. So yes.
Okay.
so I guess though my question
Yeah.
is,
And Amanda, as far as the presentations, at the last CAC meeting, we actually hustled and got you the slides ahead of time. But it is awfully difficult to do that because it's changing so much, especially if there's a TMC or another committee meeting in between. And the packet goes out the week before the meeting. So that's why typically we don't include the slides in the presentation, in the packet. We do try to, but you'll typically see it the day of, but we'll work on that. But we did do it last time for you, just so that you had a heads up.
yeah, I just think it would be really helpful. And because we can send out stuff, update the agenda and everything 24 hours in advance or 48 hours in advance. So I think that given the timeline with the TMC, I appreciate the hustle. and turn around on these stuff. So, Pocky, I hear your, your situation. I just, something, if the bare bones are there and just updating some of those numbers, it would just be super helpful. And then on the inflation rate, I think it would just, I guess my request to going ahead of the, turn to consultants and just ask them, what's a good rule of thumb number that we could be using at this time? Because right now we're just operating with such bad information. So it'd be helpful to just have a rule of thumb number and also have the ETA for when we could expect a more firm number of these updated values rather than, because I don't know, I've just been hearing this for a long time that we're gonna get that at some point.
All right, I know you have another question, Mas, after this, but I have Ava and Mel for their quick questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what, others have already said, and that I think it would be really helpful to understand the TMC rationale, especially in terms to, what was their rationale for deciding to cut what were formerly projects 26 through 37. I think that would be really helpful.
Great, thanks. And Mel.
Thank you. The sub-elements on the transit, I have substantial questions regarding what are the proper goals and how those each element could be delivered alternatively that have not been addressed. And so I don't know when we'll be able to address transit in some manner, but at a minimum, the city has identified 2 significant projects and only one is on the list, as I understand. And so that's another problem.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. You brought that up at the transit subcommittee as well, and it is something that we have to dig into. Arlen?
Yeah, and this is back to the supervisor's question to us. We don't see TMC minutes, and the minutes that we have are summaries of a meeting without the and I understand why. I'm not complaining about this. Summaries of the meeting without kind of an understanding of the flavor of the conversation. And it's the flavor of the conversation that we often miss, not only on our own, because we don't, let me speak for myself. I don't remember necessarily having reached that age, but then also for the flavor of the conversation at the TMC. So the comment that Ava just mentioned about what the rationale was and how they decided, if we knew that and if we had that, let's say at this meeting, like Bruce had suggested, so we could have that dialogue in this meeting, because all of us are not going to go to the TMC meeting, that would be helpful. And then the second part was asking the TMC, we've been focusing a lot on the percentages of these particular items relative to the RMAP. And I really, for one, would like to know how they're looking at that relative to the RMAP. We're looking at the RMAP as a sort of scriptures from on high in a sense. And I'm not necessarily certain that they look at it the same way. Maybe they do, but I don't know that. So that's the flavor of the conversation is really what I'm getting, if that helps.
But Terry, a couple of these comments have come up here in the last couple of minutes about getting a presentation from the TMC and kind of understanding, as Arlen puts it, the flavor of the conversation. And now, you know, the question about the RMAP's importance to the committee as they're doing their thing. Do you want to add anything to that, or is it something that you can come back to us with, you know, more complete understanding, I guess, for us?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I had to unmute myself, sorry. Yeah, I think it's something that we could certainly come back to you with after. I actually missed the last meeting of the TMC because we had a council meeting at the very same time. So I wasn't there for the discussion, how they came to the final recommendations that they did. So I don't have a lot of detail on that, but I can certainly work with Jan Lesher and with Mike Ortega and some of the other board members to be able to provide that information.
Great, thanks, we appreciate it.
Go ahead, Mr. Murphy.
I was just going to remind everyone that there's a link to the video. Please do watch that on your own when you get a chance. But we'll coordinate with Terry and make sure that you have that information at the next meeting.
I'm a busy retiree, you know.
I thought this was your hobby.
I wanted to suggest two things, perhaps as a standing agenda item for the TMC. There could be some summary information that is given to the TMC members who are then going to be the liaisons to the CAC as to the information that needs to be delivered to the CAC, so that to go back to Bruce's question from the beginning of the meeting, so that the CAC members have a better understanding of why the TMC made certain decisions. So that goes back also to the question that Ms. Romero just asked. So I think if that were a standing agenda item on every TMC meeting agenda, that they provided that kind of summary so that Mr. Rosema or Mr. Ortega or whoever is going to be joining the next CAC meeting could deliver that. I think that would be helpful to all of you. The other thing I wanted to say is, and that this is not an original thought. I think this has come up from within the TMC. I think it's come up from within the CAC, is I hope that somewhere down the road, there's discussion of having a joint meeting of your two bodies. Because I think for us on the RTA board to be able to get the most broad-based recommendation, there's got to be an opportunity, perhaps even more than one opportunity, for you to have joint meetings.
So just going to add, if I may, that CAC officers attend the TMC meetings as well. Not to put you on the spot, but last meeting, unfortunately, the chair wasn't able to attend, but the vice chairs attended. So I don't know if you have anything to add. What's your perspective of what they were thinking? But again, I request that you wait until they answer that question because it was somewhat unique. I don't know if you all can add to that. It was a unique conversation.
Yeah, I listened to the meeting also, and I thought it was a great meeting. I thought it was, you know, very thoughtful, and they dug into some stuff that we have not dug into here, and I thought it had some legitimate points of view that were expressed. So I think getting that feedback directly from them, or at the very least, us trying to bring that forward to you is pretty much mandatory at this point. We need to do that at every meeting, just as when we go to the TMC meetings, they always have an agenda item for us to simply say what's going on. And and to ask specific questions that we might have. So those are great suggestions. Appreciate
And
that.
I would add just at the last meeting, the TMC members, really all of them were really probing to ask what it was that we needed. And, you know, they really wanted to understand exactly what we needed because it's not always clear.
Well, sometimes we don't really know what.
Exactly.
Sometimes we know what we don't know, but not even all the time.
So that was difficult.
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
I wouldn't want to get into the details of the discussion where they spoke to cutting back on certain areas of the 37 through 26. But I can tell you, I was extremely impressed with the logic behind it and what they were trying to do. It was very thoughtful. And I was excited to hear that they're thinking well through the conversation of where do we find enough money to do what we need to do with the pools that we've been given. So I hope once we're able to get the actual details so that we can explain it or have somebody on the TMC explain it, I hope everybody will take it and listen to it for what it is, because I thought it was very well done.
Thank you for saying that. I was going to say it, but I want to make sure I hear it from your perspective as well. I really thought it was well debated, discussed, and their decision ultimately was a fiscal constraint solution.
Okay, Moss, you have 30 seconds for
30 seconds.
That's all I'll have to go.
So I guess I had a couple of questions about getting clarity on how projects have been spent, unnamed categorical funds have been spent from RTA 1. So I'll just send those along. But I'll close with just saying that, you know, Arlen, Carolyn, I really appreciated your feedback on the proposal. And, you know, I think Edmund, it sounded like you maybe were a little confused that the proposal that I put together really is actually based on experts in the region, because that came from the RMAP, which was all designed by data from the RTA and PAG and the jurisdiction. So that's grounded in that reality. The other thing that we've been looking at from staff is really just based on RTA 1 budget. So it's not, I would say it's actually really outdated for our current times. But yeah, Arlen, Carolyn, you had good feedback. I'm happy to make some tweaks to this and send that around to staff so that they can include that for the next meeting in those packets and provide some ideas of what it would look like to have carryover projects come out of the roadway budget rather than off the top. And Carolyn, we could also look at what would look like to have no environmental section and have those wildlife linkages under safety. And Bruce, also appreciated your comments about the philosophical differences. I agree, those are really, really important, and look forward to having those conversations, and I'll send these other questions to the crew. So great meeting, folks.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Well,
6 minutes. You have a chance.
Well, you're not invited back. No, it's great. I enjoy driving to the east side at 5.
I feel that. Take the bus, Tom. You'll be fine. Transit, you'll be good.
All right. We are hereby adjourned.
Thank you.